You think you're just loving him. But what if you're actually trying to be chosen by his ego? And what if that's the very reason you're slowly disappearing in the process? What if every time you soften your words to protect his feelings, every time you bite back your truth to keep the peace, every time you praise his potential while your own dreams gather dust? What if you're not loving him at all? What if you're negotiating with your own unworthiness and calling it love? Carl Jung once said, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the entire ego personality." But what happens when your desire to love someone turns into a pattern of constantly walking on eggshells just to protect his ego? What happens when the love you give becomes a sacrifice of your voice, your needs, and your self-worth? This is not about manipulation. This is not about playing games or withholding affection. This is about power, the power of the unconscious, and how most women unknowingly touch a man's ego in a way that doesn't make him love them, but makes them lose themselves. If you've ever found yourself shrinking to make room for someone else's comfort, if you've ever felt like you're performing in your own relationship, if you've ever wondered why your kindness feels invisible while your boundaries feel impossible, stay with me, because what I'm about to share will change how you see love, how you see yourself, and how you understand the hidden forces that have been shaping your relationships without your conscious permission. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. This isn't about withholding love. This is about discovering the difference between loving from wholeness and loving from a wound that believes it must earn its place in this world. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's 31, works in marketing, and has been with her partner David for 2 years. On paper, they're perfect together, but Sarah has noticed something troubling. Every morning she wakes up calculating, not her schedule or her to-do list, but his mood. Will he be distant today? Did she say something wrong last night? Should she make his favorite coffee or give him space? She's become a detective of his ego, reading micro-expressions like tea leaves, adjusting her energy to match what she thinks he needs. You were taught that if you're kind enough, patient enough, soft enough, he will finally choose you. But here's what no one told you. The more you focus your energy on feeding his fragile ego, the more invisible you become. Because men don't fall in love with who makes their ego feel safe. They fall in love with who makes their shadow feel seen. Without needing to fix it, let's go deeper. According to Jung, every man carries an inner division. The persona he shows to the world and the shadow he hides, even from himself. The persona is his acceptable face. It's confident, capable, in control. It's the version of himself he's been rewarded for since childhood. But the shadow holds his fears, his doubts, his tender places, his rage, his shame, his deep longing to be known beyond his achievements. When a woman unknowingly tries to love the persona, she ends up negotiating with a mask, and that's when the cycle begins. You feel unseen, you try harder, you give more, you lose more, not because you're not enough, but because you've been loving from a place of lack, and he feels it. Sarah tells me she's tired of feeling like she's auditioning for love. She's tired of celebrating his wins while her own accomplishments feel small in comparison. She's tired of being understanding about his stress while her own overwhelm gets labeled as too much. But here's the deeper truth Sarah is beginning to discover. Every time she adjusts herself to fit his comfort, she's not loving him. She's loving the safety of being needed. Jung called this projection. We project our unlived life, our disowned parts, our secret fears onto the people closest to us. Sarah isn't trying to make David happy. She's trying to prove that she's worthy of staying. Pause here. Take a breath. Is this what you've been carrying all along? Because the shadow doesn't just belong to him. It belongs to you too. Your shadow holds the part of you that believes love is earned through performance. The part that learned, somewhere along the way, that your natural self wasn't quite enough. The part that whispers, if you stop trying so hard, he'll see who you really are, and leave. But what if that whisper is the very thing keeping you from being truly seen? Here's the truth. No one wants to admit. Every time you soften your voice to avoid hurting his pride, you are wounding your own voice. Every time you praise his potential just to keep his interest, you are betraying your own emotional reality. Every time you bite back your truth to preserve his comfort, you are teaching your soul that its authentic expression is too dangerous for love. And the paradox, the more you touch his ego from a place of need, the more he distances himself from you, because his ego feels that you're seeking worth through him, not from wholeness within you. And at an unconscious level, this feels suffocating to him, even if he can't articulate why. This is the very wound you must face. The belief that your value comes from being needed. That if you aren't stroking his ego, managing his emotions, anticipating his needs, you'll be abandoned. Let me share what Jung discovered about this pattern. He called it the transcendent function. The bridge between our conscious intentions and our unconscious drives. This function is supposed to help us integrate opposing forces within ourselves, but when it's underdeveloped, we live in constant internal conflict. Consciously, you want to love, but unconsciously, you're trying to heal a much older wound that has nothing to do with him. Maybe it was the father who was too busy building his career to notice you unless you achieved something impressive. So you learned that love comes through accomplishment, through being valuable, rather than just being yourself. Maybe it was the mother who only offered affection when you were good, quiet, compliant, easy to manage. So you learned that love is conditional on your ability to not be a burden. Maybe it was the early relationship where your vulnerability was met with criticism or withdrawal, teaching you that your emotional needs were too much for anyone to handle. Maybe it was growing up in a household where conflict was avoided at all costs, where keeping peace meant someone always had to sacrifice their truth. And somehow, you learned that person should be you. So you learn to love with your ego instead of your essence. You learn to love strategically instead of authentically. You learned to love as a way of proving your worth instead of expressing your truth. You learned to love as insurance against abandonment instead of celebration of connection. But here's what happens when you love from this unconscious place. You start to resent the very person you're trying to love. Because deep down, you know you're not being seen. You're being appreciated for your service, not celebrated for your soul. You're valued for what you do, not cherished for who you are. And he starts to feel the weight of your unspoken expectations, the pressure of your need disguised as care, the subtle but unmistakable energy that says, I'm doing all this for you, so please don't leave. Please validate that I'm worth staying for. This creates what Jung called a complex, an autonomous emotional pattern that runs your relationship from behind the scenes. Think of it like an invisible puppet master pulling strings without your conscious awareness. The complex says, I must be indispensable to be irreplaceable, but the soul knows, I must be myself to be truly loved. The complex whispers, if I stop giving so much, he'll realize he can do better. But the soul knows, abundant love flows from abundance within, not from fear of scarcity. The complex insists, his needs matter more than mine because if he's happy, I'm safe. but the soul knows. Two whole people create a relationship. One whole person and one disappearing person create an imbalance that destroys intimacy. If this part hits something in you, keep going. The next few minutes might feel like a mirror. Let me tell you about another woman, Maria. She came to understand this pattern through a moment of devastating clarity. Sarah came to this realization. During an argument with David, he'd criticized the way she loaded the dishwasher, something small and petty. But instead of defending herself or laughing it off, she found herself apologizing profusely and asking how he preferred it done. But Maria's moment came differently. She was at her sister's wedding, watching her sister and new brother-in-law's first dance. They were laughing, completely absorbed in each other, both of them radiating joy. Maria looked around and realized she couldn't remember the last time she and her partner Tom had shared a moment of pure, unguarded joy together. Later, alone in her hotel room, she reflected on their 5-year relationship. She realized that almost every interaction was calculated on her part. She monitored his stress levels and adjusted her energy accordingly. She celebrated his successes with more enthusiasm than her own. She'd turned herself into his personal emotional weather system, always shifting to ensure his forecast was sunny, and she felt a rage that surprised her, not at him, but at herself. When did I become this person? She asked herself. When did I start apologizing for existing in my own life? This is the moment Jung called the encounter with the shadow. When you see, with devastating clarity, how you've been living from a kind pattern instead of your authentic self. When you realize that you've been unconsciously recreating the same dynamic over and over, hoping for different results. The shadow isn't evil. The shadow is simply the parts of yourself you've disowned to be loved, to be safe, to belong. For Maria, her shadow held her anger, the part of her that wanted to be chosen first sometimes, that wanted her needs to matter as much as his, that was tired of being the relationship's emotional manager. For Sarah, her shadow held her ambition, the part of her that wanted to pursue photography seriously, that dreamed of opening her own studio, that felt stifled by always making David's goals the priority. For you, your shadow might hold your intensity, your independence, your need for deep conversation, your desire for adventure, your sensitivity, your strength, your opinions, your dreams. But here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. Those disowned parts hold the very essence that makes you magnetic, powerful, unforgettable. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This isn't fate. This is your shadow asking to be seen. This is your soul asking to be expressed. This is your essence asking to be honored instead of hidden. The question isn't whether you're worthy of love. The question is whether you're willing to love yourself enough to stop betraying who you are. Pause here. Notice what's happening in your body right now. Your nervous system is responding to truth, even when your mind wants to resist it. Jung understood that the shadow contains not just our wounds, but our unrealized potential. When we repress parts of ourselves to be accepted, we don't just lose our authenticity. We lose access to our power, our creativity, our life force. Think about it. When you're constantly managing someone else's emotional state, when are you creating? When you're perpetually accommodating someone else's preferences, when are you discovering your own? When you're always being understanding about someone else's stress, when are you processing your own? The shadow work isn't about becoming selfish or uncaring. It's about becoming whole. It's about integrating the parts of yourself you've been carrying in the darkness back into the light of conscious expression. And here's what Jung discovered. When you stop hiding from your shadow, when you stop being afraid of your own complexity, you become truly attractive. not because you're trying to be attractive, but because wholeness is magnetic in a world full of people performing their personas. The woman who has integrated her shadow doesn't need to touch his ego to feel worthy. She touches it from choice, not from need. She loves from abundance, not from fear. She challenges from care, not from control. But first, you have to be willing to see how the wound has been running your love life, how the unconscious pattern has been directing your relationships while you called it devotion. This moment of recognition is painful because it requires you to take responsibility for your part in the dynamic, not blame. Responsibility, there's a difference. Blame says, I've been a victim of my conditioning. Responsibility says, I've been unconsciously recreating my conditioning, and now I have the power to choose differently. The journey from unconscious pattern to conscious choice is the essence of individuation, Jung's term for becoming who you truly are, separate from the roles and personas you've adopted to survive and belong. And this journey, it's not just personal healing, it's a gift to love itself. Because the world needs people who love from wholeness, not from wounds. The world needs people who can see and accept the full spectrum of human experience, not just the acceptable parts. If you need to pause the video here and breathe, do it. This work isn't easy, but it's the most important work you'll ever do. Here's the shift. You don't stop loving. You stop shrinking. You don't become cold. You become clear. You don't stop caring about his feelings. You start caring about the truth more than his comfort. You touch his ego without fear, not to break it, but to invite authenticity. Let me tell you what this looks like in real life, because the theory only matters if it can transform the daily moments that make up a relationship. Sarah started an experiment. Instead of managing David's moods, she started expressing her own. Instead of reading his energy and adjusting hers, she started honoring what was true for her in each moment. The first test came on a Thursday evening. David came home stressed about a project deadline, and typically, Sarah would have immediately shifted into caretaker mode, making his favorite dinner, asking gentle questions, offering solutions, essentially becoming his personal stress relief system. Instead, she was honest about her own state. When he walked through the door radiating tension, instead of immediately going into fix-it mode or absorbing his frustration, she said, I can see you're having a hard time. I want to be here for you, and I also need to finish this presentation for tomorrow. Can we set aside 30 minutes to talk about your day, and then I'll need some quiet time to focus? At first, David was taken aback. He was used to Sarah dropping everything to attend to his needs, to her making his emotional weather the climate of their entire home. But something interesting happened. Instead of getting angry, he felt relief. For the first time, he was interacting with a whole person, instead of someone who disappeared into his emotional landscape. You see, when you touch his ego from your center, from your own wholeness, you're not trying to manage his reaction. You're simply being honest about your reality. But this shift requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. You can love someone and maintain your boundaries. You can care about someone's feelings and speak your truth. You can be supportive and refuse to lose yourself in someone else's story. Most of us learned that love requires us to choose. Either you're loving or you're selfish. Either you're caring or you're cold. Either you accommodate or you're difficult. But mature love, what Jung would call individuated love, holds both truths simultaneously. You say things like, I see your strength, but I also see where you hide, and that's okay with me. I respect you, but I will no longer betray myself to keep your comfort intact. I love you, and I love myself enough to speak my truth, even when it's uncomfortable. I want to support you, And I need you to support me too. I'm attracted to your confidence, and I'm also drawn to your vulnerability when you let me see it. This is not cruel. This is sacred tension. Because when a man is confronted with a woman who holds her center, who dares to challenge him with love, his ego is not broken. It is shaped. It's invited to evolve beyond the narrow confines of what he thought was required for acceptance. Jung called this the transcendent function in action. When two people meet authentically, when both shadows are illuminated without judgment, both souls have the opportunity to grow. But here's the key. You can only do this when you're no longer afraid of losing him. Not because you don't care, but because you finally remembered that losing yourself is a far greater tragedy than losing someone who can't love your authentic self. Pause here. Notice what's coming up for you. This is your soul responding to the truth. It's been waiting to hear. Let me tell you about the second test. In Sarah's experiment, a few weeks later, David made a comment about how Sarah had been different lately. Not as attentive, not as immediately available to his needs. There was a subtle accusation in his tone, a suggestion that she was being selfish. Old Sarah would have immediately backtracked, apologized, and overcompensated by being extra accommodating for the next week. But Sarah, who was beginning to understand the difference between love and self-abandonment, took a breath and said, "You're right. I have been different. I've been practicing staying true to myself while loving you. If that feels like less attention, I understand that adjustment might be uncomfortable. But this version of me is more honest, and I think our relationship will be stronger because of it." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. I actually like this version of you. I didn't realize it until now, but I was starting to feel suffocated. Not by your love, but by the feeling that I was responsible for your happiness. This is the paradox Jung understood. When we stop making ourselves smaller to make others more comfortable, we actually create space for deeper intimacy. The sacred way to touch his ego is to meet it with your own wholeness, to say, through your presence, "I see you. I'm not afraid of your shadow, and I'm not going to hide mine." To demonstrate, through your actions, "I love you enough to be real with you, even when it's inconvenient." To show, through your boundaries, "I value this relationship, and I value myself. Both matter." This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, becoming who you truly are, not who you think you need to be loved. Individuation isn't a selfish process. It's actually a gift to every relationship you'll ever have, because it allows you to love from choice rather than from need. And here's the beautiful paradox. The more you individuate, the more attractive you become. Not because you're trying to be attractive, but because authenticity is magnetic in a world full of people performing their personas. Men don't fall in love with women who make them feel comfortable in their limitations. They fall in love with women who make them feel alive, challenged, seen in their complexity, invited to grow. They fall in love with women who reflect their potential without trying to fix their shadow. They fall in love with women who say, through their very being, "I see all of you, and I'm not going anywhere. And I'm also not going to lose myself in you." But this kind of love requires courage, the courage to risk being rejected for who you truly are, rather than being accepted for who you pretend to be. What would you say or do differently in your relationship if you weren't afraid of his reaction? Let me share another story that illustrates this principle. Maria, the woman I mentioned earlier, had a breakthrough during what could have been a relationship-ending argument with Tom. They were planning a vacation, and Tom wanted to go somewhere relaxing. A beach resort where they could do nothing but lie in the sun and drink cocktails. Maria had been dreaming of a photography trip to Iceland, something that would feed her creative soul and challenge her artistically. For years, Maria would have immediately deferred to Tom's preference, maybe suggesting they could do her idea another time, which never came. She would have convinced herself that his happiness mattered more than her desires. But this time, she said, "I understand you need rest and relaxation, and I need creative inspiration and adventure. Instead of one of us sacrificing what we truly want, let's figure out how we can both get what we need. Maybe we take 2 separate trips this year, or maybe we find a compromise that honors both of our desires." Tom's initial reaction was defensive. He accused her of being selfish, of not caring about his stress levels. But Maria, instead of backing down or over-explaining, simply said, "I care deeply about your stress, and I've learned that caring for myself actually makes me a better partner to you. When I ignore my own needs, I become resentful and distant. When I honor them, I can love you from a full heart." This conversation opened up a discussion they'd never had before, about how they each felt in the relationship, about patterns they'd fallen into, about what they each needed to feel truly seen and valued. They ended up planning a trip to New Zealand, a place that offered both the natural beauty and adventure Maria craved, and the luxury accommodations and relaxation Tom needed. But more importantly, they learned how to touch each other's egos without losing themselves in the process. When you touch his ego from this place, from deep self-love and unshakable knowing of your own worth, you're not manipulating or managing. You're inviting, you're challenging, you're loving, and you're doing it all without losing a single piece of yourself. Take a moment here. How would your relationships change if you loved others from your wholeness instead of your woundedness? To touch a man's ego deeply and not lose yourself, you must first see where your own wounds shaped your love. Because the woman who's most magnetic isn't the one who flatters his pride. It's the one who mirrors his soul. With clarity, dignity, and boundaries, Sarah's relationship with David transformed when she stopped trying to be everything for him and started being fully herself. She stopped managing his emotions and started expressing her own. She stopped anticipating his needs and started honoring her own. She stopped walking on eggshells and started dancing to her own rhythm. And David fell in love with her all over again. Not because she became perfect, but because she became real. Not because she stopped caring about him, but because she started caring about herself. Not because she touched his ego differently, but because she touched it from a completely different place, from wholeness instead of woundedness, from choice instead of need, from love instead of fear. You don't need to be everything for him. You need to be fully you, without apology. Love that costs. You yourself isn't love. It's self-abandonment, wearing the mask of care. Jung understood that every relationship is a mirror, reflecting back to us the parts of ourselves we've either integrated or rejected. When you love from your shadow, from the place that believes you must earn affection, you attract someone who will confirm this belief. When you love from your essence, from the place that knows you are inherently worthy, you attract someone who sees and celebrates your wholeness. The question isn't how to touch his ego without losing yourself. The question is, how do I love from such a deep knowing of my own worth that I never risk losing myself in the first place? Here's a simple practice Jung would have appreciated. Before you speak to him, ask yourself, am I about to speak from my wound or from my wisdom? Before you adjust your energy to match his, ask yourself, am I honoring my authentic self or abandoning it? Before you praise or comfort or accommodate, ask yourself, am I loving him or am I trying to be loved? This is your moment. This is where everything changes. Are you ready to love from your truth instead of your trauma? So next time you feel the urge to protect his ego, ask yourself, am I truly loving him, or am I quietly begging to be enough? The moment you stop touching his ego to be chosen is the moment he starts seeing the woman he can never forget. The moment you start loving from your wholeness instead of your wound is the moment you become unforgettable to yourself. And that, Jung would say, is the real work. Not becoming someone who can perfectly navigate his ego, but becoming someone who is so deeply at home in her own soul that she never loses herself in anyone else's story. The shadow work isn't about fixing him or managing his reactions. The shadow work is about integrating the parts of yourself you've been hiding to be loved. The shadow work is about discovering that you are not too much, too sensitive, too intense, too anything. You are exactly as you should be, and the right love will see this and celebrate it, not ask you to edit it. When you touch a man's ego from this place, from deep self-love and unshakable knowing of your own worth, you're not manipulating or managing. You're inviting. You're challenging. You're loving. And you're doing it all without losing a single piece of yourself. Because the greatest gift you can give to love is a whole person, and the greatest gift you can give to yourself is the courage to be that whole person, no matter who's watching. If this message resonated with something deep in your soul, I want to hear from you. Share in the comments what you're ready to reclaim about yourself. And if you're ready to dive deeper into this work, subscribe for more insights that honor both your psychology and your soul. This is the sacred way. This is how you love without losing yourself. This is how you touch his ego and keep your essence intact. Not by becoming smaller, but by becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. The journey of individuation is lifelong, but it begins with a single choice. The choice to value your authentic self more than others' comfort with your personas. It begins with the decision to touch his ego. And everyone's ego, from your center, not your circumference. It begins with the revolutionary act of loving yourself so deeply that you never again confuse self-abandonment with care. This is not the end of your journey. This is the beginning of relationships that honor your soul, the beginning of love that expands rather than diminishes you, the beginning of touching others in ways that invite growth, not compliance. The integration continues. The healing deepens. The love becomes real, and you remember who you were before the world taught you to shrink. You remember what it feels like to love from wholeness. You remember that you are worthy of being chosen for exactly who you are. Welcome home to yourself. Welcome home to love that doesn't cost you your soul. Welcome home